Welcome to another episode of That's Some Crazy Shit with Kelly and James. I am Kelly and my co-host, as always, is James. What's happening?
What's going on, Kel?
What's happening, Captain? I think it goes like, what's happening, Captain, or something like that. I can't say it right. Anyway.
What's happening, Captain?
Thank you. What's happening? Anyway, I'm really excited today, James, because we have yet another guest. We are on a guest roll, right?
We are.
And so today is like a personal guest because you actually know this person.
I do. I've known Molly and Candy for, it's hard to say, 30 years, you know? Well, not that long, sorry. But it's funny because I didn't know they had these paranormal experiences until we started this podcast. And then, just kind of talking to them, they've come out. And she's had experiences with ghosts in her house. She grew up in a haunted house. And she also had some experience with cow mutilations. So we thought we'd bring her on and she could share her experiences.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's not every day that you know somebody who actually grew up in a real haunted house.
Really? It's serious.
So I'm excited to hear her stories. You know what, James? I think we should just get right to it and bring her on in.
Let's do it.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the podcast, Molle Hess. Molly, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and being a part of That's Some Crazy Shit. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. I'm excited. So, James, why don't you take this, give us a little background about Molly, and we'll get started.
Okay, well, the way I know Molly is through her daughter. I've worked with Candy for many years, and they've kind of adopted me as the black sheep of the family, and I appreciate that. And through the years, she's told me some stories about her paranormal experiences, and so I thought it'd be nice to have her come on and share with our listeners.
Cool. So, Molly, James says that you had lived in a haunted house.
I did. I grew up in one.
You grew up in a haunted house.
Yes.
So, what made you think that the house was haunted?
Well, I am the youngest of 4 daughters, and we lived in a little grandma and grandpa house right on 50th South and Redwood Road. And there was only 2 bedrooms and a basement. And my older sisters would stay down in the basement, and the younger ones, my sister and I, would sleep up top. And we always had things happen, like we would hear something go up and down the basement stairs. And it was never scary. My mother would say, "Oh, that's our ghost." And then my mother had an old treadle sewing machine, and we would be up in the living room upstairs and hear the sewing machine going.
Was it one of those old kind of paddles?
Maybe 5-10 minutes. Yes.
With the paddle?
And so of course nobody would be downstairs.
Right.
So you were never, so these things, I guess, you grew up in the house, so they were just normal to you?
They were, and they were not scary.
How old were you?
We had many incidences that occurred. One, my mother got very sick in the middle of the night, and they had to take her to the hospital. And I woke up about in the middle of the night. I was probably 10 or 12, and something was at the foot of my bed. And it appeared to be a woman or a girl, and she said, "Your mother has been taken to the hospital, but she is fine. So don't worry about it." So when I woke up the next morning, I went in for breakfast and I said, "Well, how's mother? Is she through at the hospital yet? Is she back home?" And my older sisters looked at me and said, how did you know she was at the hospital?" And I said, because somebody told me, something came to me in the middle of the night and told me Mother was at the hospital.
Can you describe it, Molly, what you saw?
It was, well, this was the first time, and it was more or less a young female, and she was dressed kind of like in a dress. So it was, probably in the 50s, so she didn't have jeans or anything. It was a dress, and I can't really figure out what she looked like, but just her presence at the end of the bed. But that's not the only time she found me. When I got married, my husband and I lived in a trailer, a single wide trailer. And I remember we were asleep in the middle of the night, and I heard footsteps go down the hall and stop at the end of my bed. And in that half sleep, half awake, I kind of rose up, and this, whatever it was a female again, said, "Maudie, where is Maudie?" And that was my mother's name. And I said, "She's not here." And then I went back to sleep, and I assume it left. But what was interesting was I never told my mother. And 2 or 3 days after that, my mother said, the funny thing happened. I was in bed, and something called to me in the kitchen. And it was exactly the same night that I had it hit me.
Wow. Ooh, that's scary. That gave me chills a little bit.
Yeah.
Did you ever tell your husband?
Many stories like this.
Did you ever tell your husband?
Oh, yeah. But he was a cowboy. He went, oh, yeah. All of the family knew that there was ghosts in the house.
So there was more than one?
No, there was just the one, but more of them, all of the family knew that it was in the house.
So did you ever try to find out who it was, or do you think you knew who it may have been?
My father did an abstract on the property, and he found out that there was a young girl that had died in a horse accident right there on the corner.
Wow, I wonder if that was the girl that appeared to you, this young girl.
That's kind of what we all thought.
Wow.
So what other instances can you remember from the house?
This ghost was really into my mother. And my mother had to go to the hospital to have surgery. And that was when the kids and I were gone. And the ghost, started slamming cupboards. And she slammed the door. Now the door was always a lock. So to hear it open, we went and it was locked. It was a deadbolt. So my father actually had to get up in the middle of the night, go downstairs and say, "Maud is in the hospital. She's fine. She'll be coming home in a couple of days." And then it stopped.
And then the energy kind of calmed down after you let her know what was going on.
Yeah.
Wow. And that makes sense that the young ghost would kind of attach to your mother, like a mother figure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Mother and Dad went to a funeral. A very good friend of theirs died. And they were coming back. They opened up the back door, and all of a sudden the whole house smelled of roses. And it lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then it was gone.
Wow.
We didn't have any roses in the house.
And to have that many roses to make your entire house smell like roses, that would be a lot of flowers.
And everybody in the house could smell it.
Right. Well, it was just my mother and dad at that time.
Wow.
And the one thing about our ghost is you don't think about it and then it happens. You may be watching TV and the back door opens and slams but you're not anticipating it. So it has to be an energy that's doing that.
And you're not afraid.
No. Now the grandkids were.
Oh. Were they not used to that?
Candy didn't want to go downstairs.
Oh, I know Candy. I'm going to give her a hard time now.
And what happened to that house? Is that house still there? Does somebody else live there?
No. And what is funny is my mother at 74 broke her hip, and it was in June. And they did an operation on her, and then she had a cardiac arrest. Took her a couple of days to die. And there was really a lot of slamming doors, and when she had passed away in the hospital, and my father had to go out and say, she's gone. We never heard from the ghost again.
No
Evidently, the ghost went with my mother.
And that would make sense too.
And that would make sense.
Uh-huh. So now the house is torn down.
And it's funny, I live not too far from there. I wonder if they have had any other paranormal experiences. That's only a couple blocks from where I'm at now.
Ooh.
Well, and what's interesting is I taught junior high for 46 years, science, and I always told my kids this story. I said, the one thing you've got to realize is not everything can be explained.
Exactly.
Being a scientist, I understand, but not everything can be explained. I had a very good friend who, when she was little, fell on a pair of scissors and it went in her eye. And her grandmother had just come back from France, from Lourdes, and she had the little bottle of
Water, wow.
water sawed off. You know how you would cut a steak?
Right.
It was straight. The eye was gone, holy water. And so they patched the eye up, and the doctor said she'll never see out of that eye again. So the grandmother, every day, put a little drop of holy water on her bandage, and after a month, they took the bandage off, and she could see out of it.
And I've
She
seen
couldn't
Lourdes,
drive at night.
but she
But
was
she
supposed
could
to be
see.
blind. Yeah.
But she could see, and they said that she would be blind.
Right.
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 And when you see pictures of Lourdes, there's crutches everywhere around it where people who couldn't walk without crutches have left their crutches there and walked away.
Uh-huh. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of things that are unexplainable.
There are.
Yeah, very true. Very
And I think
true.
that's why we talk about things. You know, we want to emphasize just because science can't explain it doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means
Right.
we can't explain it.
Right.
Now, Molly,
So
did you ever
think
have anyone?
46 years, how many kids that I taught? And it was all science. It was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And I told them the stories all the time to get them to think and that realize that there's not always answers that can be had.
Right.
And sometimes you have to think out of the box. I was never afraid at my house growing up. Now, my sister told me a story, the one right next to me. And when she was 17, she had her boyfriend that she truly loved went in the Army, and he sent her a kind of Dear Jane letter. She cried for weeks. And she says one night, she had cried herself to sleep, and something touched her face and her head. And it did it 3 times. And every time she'd wake up and there would be nothing there. And it was kind of like, you're okay. And the ghost was giving her some comfort.
That's nice. And it's funny you mentioned 3 times because we've talked about the number 3
Uh-huh.
having kind of a mystical power to it, really.
Oh, they say things happen in 3s,
Right.
right?
The Holy
So-
Trinity, sign of the cross, you know.
Right.
Hindu, the 3 main Hindu gods.
Well,
Well, that's
I'm,
interesting.
I'm really into ancient aliens. And 3 is the number.
It is.
You know,
it
they go
is.
into 3 is the number on all the pyramids and stuff.
Yeah. So James had mentioned too that you had experiences with cattle mutilations. What was that like? I mean, did you live on the ranch and actually have your cattle mutilated?
Well, my husband, Candy's dad, grew up in a small town in northern Utah called Howell, Utah. And he enjoyed being a teenager. So what I'm meaning is the sheriff in Box Elder County knew my husband well. You grew up in a small town. He knew him well. So he and his best friend were driving along the dirt road, and they saw this. It wasn't one of our cattle, but this great big bull was dead, and it was up against a fence. And so being 17, 18, 19, you're curious, you're boys. So they get out of the car, and it was in a meadow, so it was kind of spongy. They walked over to the bull. It had no blood around it. There were patches of skin taken off. The tongue was gone, and it was not, and the testicles were gone. And so my husband and his friend were looking at this, and all of a sudden, here comes the sheriff. And he backs up on the road and walks over, and my husband said, "This is really quite a deal." And there was no tracks in and out.
Right, yeah.
And this is a 1,500-pound bull. And the sheriff just kind of looked at my husband and said, "I want you to get back in your car. I want you to forget you've ever seen this. And you are to keep your mouth shut and not tell anybody." And my husband, goofing off, says, "Oh, come on, Sheriff, And he said, "I'm not kidding, Terry. This is what I want you to do. Please leave."
And we talked about cattle mutilations, and that's very typical of the things that happen. The no blood, the precision cuts, the authorities showing up and encouraging people not to say anything. Very interesting.
Yeah. In this small area, my father-in-law, who was a farmer, worked at Taylorsville, where they made all the rockets and stuff. And he was out irrigating at 2 o'clock in the morning, probably in the 30s or 40s. And he looks up and he sees these lights up in the sky. And they are not moving like an airplane. They are buzzing all around, and he watches them for maybe a half hour. And there's no way that that a plane would do this. So he went home, and that next morning, he says to, my husband was there and his wife, and he explained what had happened. And my husband said, "You've got to go talk to Taylorsville. You've got to go tell him." And he says, "They're just going to laugh at me?" And he says, "No, you have to go talk to him." So he went to work, and his supervisor, he said, "I saw this funny thing over Howell." Now, Howell is right by Taylorsville.
Now, Molly, for our listeners who don't know, Taylorsville makes the rocket engines and things for NASA, so they do a lot of testing out there for our listeners who aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, they made the propellant for the space shuttle. Yeah. So anyway, he went in and told his supervisor, and the supervisor said, "Oh, well, that's interesting." And so my father-in-law went back to work. It wasn't an hour or two, and they went and got him. And he said, "You need to come in this room." And they were talking to Washington, D.C., and he was talking to them for over 8 hours explaining what it was.
Wow.
Because northern Utah was a hot spot for UFOs.
Still is, yeah. We still have a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. That's crazy with the cattle, with the bull, and the
bull. Yeah, we talked about how large these animals
we just talked about cattle mutilation.
Right.
And 2,000-pound, 1,500-pound bull just taken down, and that's crazy.
That is.
Well, and no blood.
And yes, no blood. That's the one for me, no blood.
Yeah.
Yeah. That just makes you
and they
wonder.
weren't all dissected. It was parts taken off.
Right. Surgically removed.
Yeah, selected.
Exactly.
Selected parts,
Surgically removed.
Usually it's the sex organs, tends to be eyes for some reason.
Yeah, for some reason.
And there's never any blood. That's what blows me away. I mean, these animals have a ton of fluid in them. Where's it all going?
Yes. Where is it all going?
Now, Molly, you grew up, on a ranch and farm. You had experience with predators like coyotes and things like that. Could a predator do these things?
No. No, because at that time when my husband found it, he was a medical technologist, so he knew the use of medicine to do this, and he said no, this was because a coyote or a wolf would go in and would eat it, and would go for the belly, because that's what the predators usually do.
Soft underbelly.
And there was none of that. They wouldn't take patches of skin off or the testicle or the eye out.
Well, and I had read an article by a veterinarian that said if you're going to do that, if you're going to do these types of surgical cuts on a bull, you would need wading boots just because all the fluid that would come out of the bull laying on its side like that. There's no way that there would be not one drop of blood. There is no blood. That still blows my mind. That is some crazy shit to me. That's nuts. That is nuts. Have you had any other paranormal experiences that you can think of?
The ghost and stuff pretty much died with my mother.
Thank you, Molly, so much. I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us. Thank you so much.
Well, I enjoyed talking about it because, it wasn't scary. It was the way we grew up. It was just part of life.
James's coworker, Candy, who is also Molly's daughter, wanted to share her experiences of her grandparents having a haunted house.
What I wanted to add that I think was more impactful to me that Mom, I think, has just gotten so used to was growing up, going and visiting Grandma's house where Mom was raised. I think the layout of the house was really important in the fact that you would come through the back door, and the back door had you opened one door, and then it was like a little tiny 4x4 area where they had the freezer there, and then you turned to the left, and then there was the actual door to get into the house. And that door had the old style where it had a window and it had blinds in it. Not in the actual door like today's doors, but remember hanging on the outside. And anytime you opened that door and closed it, the blinds would shake and hit the glass. I don't know if you guys were raised in a house similar. It was kind of a popular thing back then. And when Mom talks about the door opening and shutting, you would hear the door open and slam, but then you would also hear those blinds slam. And I remember multiple times when the door would slam, and Mom at this point wouldn't even look up. Us kids would go and look to see who was opening the door, because you would open that door and automatically you open the door, you could either go down this long creepy flight of stairs that ended in a dead end, and then you either went to the right or to the left to the two rooms. So the long flight of stairs went to a wall, or you could turn right and then go into the small kitchen, and then through the kitchen into the living room. So we would always be in the living room, and you would hear the door slam, and you would look to see who was coming in the house, because aunts and uncles and cousins were always coming in, and then no one would be there. But it was that slamming of the blinds that I remember distinctly all the time. And even though the door was locked, often the blinds would be shaking. After you would hear the slam, if you'd go to look, the blinds were still vibrating, having slammed, but the door was still locked. So I remember as a kid that really freaking me out.
Yeah.
But you would hear the door slam, but it would still be locked when you would go look.
Correct. But then the blinds would still be shaking.
See, that's
It was,
scary.
and then, so, and that's what I remember. I mean, I think Mom's so used to just the door, but I remember as a kid those blinds, because the blinds would slap, you know? And then I think another detail that Mom has forgotten is my grandma had one of those glass shelving units. What are those called that you would put little figurines?
Like a curio or something?
Curio, yeah, that's exactly it. A curio in the living room. So past the kitchen into the living room. So 2 rooms past the door. And when the ghost got really upset when Grandma was in the hospital the first time, the vibrations from the door were so strong that the figurines my grandma had would fall over, and several of them broke during that time. So it wasn't just the sound of the door, it had a vibration into the house. And it was, I remember she always collected these little figurines of like dogs, because my grandpa showed dogs, and several of them broke during that time. So that's another thing that I remember connected to that.
Now, to put this in perspective, Candy, remember when we had the earthquake here not too long ago, and it was like, what was it, a 3 point something, wasn't it?
Uh-huh.
Okay, we have a curio, and it tipped those over, and so it took an earthquake of, a magnitude of 3 on the Richter scale, so it must have been at least that strong to vibrate your house. Can you see the correlation I'm trying to make?
I do. Yeah. And it didn't get that intense until my grandma was in the hospital. And I remember it took a few days for Grandpa to finally say, okay, this is ridiculous, and go down and say, she's going to be okay. But I can remember that old sewing machine was still there when Mom talked about. And I remember hearing that. We'd be watching TV and you'd say, what is that noise? And you would hear that sound. And, at my age, there was no way I was going down. And Grandma would just say, oh, it's the ghost. Don't worry about it. Okay.
I know I give you a hard time about being scared, but I wouldn't go down either.
Yeah, I wouldn't go down either.
No. I tease my mom because at the bottom of this long flight of stairs is this old chair-like piece of furniture. And it's this old wood thing, and it has, it looks like something out of a spooky mansion. And it's this chair, and then behind the chair was this big oval mirror. And it had hooks on it like that you would hang your coat. And I was so mad at my mother because she brought that damn chair into her house. And I always say, why is the spooky ass chair in your house, Mother? But for Mom, it was never a negative connotation. And I think what's cool about her story and the ghost story is we hear so many where they're unsettling, or it's more of a malevolent type feeling. Right. Mom's ghost, all of us knew it loved Grandma. And I don't think any of us were surprised when Grandma died that it just left. It was gone. So, even though I was scared as a kid and I would never go down there, my cousin went down there a lot. He stayed down there a lot. He was older than me, and he'd go spend time with Grandma and Grandpa, and he'd sleep down there in the room down there. And he heard all the time footsteps up and down the stairs, up and down, walking up and down, over and over. And he was older. He was a little more used to it, but it was never, it never had a
bad, negative feeling.
Yeah, and it loved my grandma.
Wow. And it does make sense with what the history she said about the little girl and stuff. It does. See, and it's nice because you go back and do the history and you can see where it kind of correlates. It makes sense where there's that little girl that she attached to, your grandma, and it just makes sense.
And maybe, who knows? I mean, that's just hypothetical.
Well, no one knows.
Who knows what it was, or who, if you will, it was, or what it was. But there is no doubt. I mean, I told my daughter this morning about how Grandma lived in a haunted house with a ghost. And she's like, ghosts aren't real. I'm like, oh, some people think, but it was it was just always a thing in the family. Mom was never scared. The sisters were never scared.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories.
Thanks, Candy.
Thank you so much, Molly, again for coming on the podcast and sharing your stories. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. You know,
And
I
you're
love
welcome.
to tell stories like that, so thank
And
you.
boy, I know you've taught a course on the paranormal, so maybe you'd like to come on and tell us about some of the cryptids you know in the future.
I would, yes. Yeah, I talked a lot about that. My kids that I taught they got a unique perspective into science. And I always wanted them to have that. Yeah. Well, thank you again for asking me to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, James, that was really cool. Molly has had some trippy, crazy-ass experiences.
Serious, to grow up in a haunted house and, be involved in cattle mutilations, that's crazy.
The part that's crazy to me is that she grew up in this haunted house and was not afraid.
Right, because she never felt, threatened. And that, I don't think we get that story out enough. I think people just always think it's just bad,
Yeah, and this ghost was really into her mom.
Yeah, I tend to think it might have been when she said a little girl passed away. I think maybe it was the little girl's spirit had attached to her like a mother figure.
Maybe. It is possible. And how you a couple of weeks ago shared your paranormal experience. And I can say I really haven't had a paranormal experience per se. But I did have something kind of freaky happen to me that I thought I would share.
All right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, and it's when I think about it, it still kind of freaks me out because I've never had anything like that happen to me. It was really strange. So
it freaks you out when this stuff happens.
So I'll tell you what happened. So, as you may or may not know, listening audience, I do another podcast called Bright-Headed Publishing Patio Book Club. And it's a podcast for aspiring authors, and they come on and talk about their books. And I had an author come on. Her name was June Adhern, and she has been a psychic for 40 years. And she wrote a book, How to Speak with Spirits. And so she came on the podcast to talk about her book. Now, before anybody comes on the podcast, I do like a quick little telephone call with them just to kind of make sure that we're on the same page, right? So when I spoke to her on the phone, she was like, "Hey, Kelly, I've been a psychic for like 40 years. I don't do it anymore. I'm retired. As far as reading individual people," she goes, "but I do teach." And she goes, "but sometimes I just see stuff and I just have to blurt it out." And I'm like, "Okay, no problem. No worries." So she comes on the podcast and we're recording and we're talking about her book. And we're recording so that we can see one another, although I don't use the video for the podcast, right?
So, what we're doing now?
Like we're doing now, right? We can see one another, but we don't use the video for the podcast because we're just not ready for video yet. Well, I'm not ready for video yet. I think James is ready to go. I'm still not there. Anyway, me and this lady are talking, me and June are talking, and I'm responding to her question. All of a sudden, she's like, "Kelly, I'm really sorry. I have to interrupt you. It's driving me crazy." And I was like, "Well, what is it, June?" She's like, "You have a spirit over your left shoulder, like right now, like over your left shoulder." And I'm like, "Okay." And she's like, "And it's not a grandmother." She goes, "I don't know. I'm picking up, I don't know, like maybe not a grandmother," she said, "but it's definitely a woman, somebody who's interested or really gung-ho about education and knowledge." And I was like, "Well, I'll be honest with you, that kind of sounds like my mom, because my mom's thing, James, as you know, growing up, was all about education, right?
Yeah.
Go to school, get your education." That's like, she drilled it into all of her children. And I'm like, "Well, yeah, that, kind of sounds like my mom." And she was like, "Yeah." She goes, "Yeah, she just, I just had to mention that to you because I see her and it's just been driving me crazy." And I said, "Well, yeah." She goes, "Yeah, and I feel that it could be your mom." So I didn't really react, and it really didn't freak me out at that point, right? it wasn't until the interview is over, and so after we're done recording, we are still talking, right? And she was like, yeah, you know, Kelly, another thing, I'm getting this spirit, this energy, whatever, also hangs around another person in your family. Somebody that's got short, black, curly hair, maybe a niece, somebody that's young. And I was like, well, short, black, curly hair? No, none of my nieces have short, black, curly hair. I said, but my daughter does.
Yeah,
and she goes, okay. She's like, that would explain it. She goes, yes. She goes, that would explain it. She goes, yep, it's definitely your mom. She's definitely been hanging around your daughter. And tell your daughter that she can talk to her grandmother anytime. She is there for her. She's like, she comes back when she feels like you need an infusion of knowledge or help. So she goes, your mom, don't worry, she's resting. She's resting on the other side, but she does come back when she says that you need an infusion of knowledge or help. And I'm like, okay. And then she's like, you know, Kelly, wait a minute. Did your mom have stomach issues? Was something happening? And I was like, well, my mom did pass away from pancreatic cancer. She's like, oh my God, that's it. Because she keeps telling me that it's burning and that she probably shouldn't have ate that food. And now that makes sense. And I was like, yes. And then she's like, she also asked me, were you young when your mom passed away? And I was like, I was just shy of my 21st birthday.
Yeah.
And she was like, yes. She says that too, which is why she comes back so often. She is determined that you and your sisters have the knowledge that she wasn't around to provide for you. I thought that was really crazy because we didn't talk about me at all during the podcast. She knew nothing about me. She didn't know I had a daughter. She didn't know my mom had passed away. And then she told me some more stuff. I was like, well, June, since you're telling the future, you can, whatever, what else can you see? What else? What else can you see? And she told me that she saw me in the summer going to outdoor venues and hanging out with musicians. So we will see, James, if in the summer I am actually hanging out with some musicians, because I'll be honest with you, I don't know any. So that was that was kind of my paranormal experience because, but what's really funny is that my daughter has told me before, because mind you, my mom died when I was young. I hadn't had children yet, so my mom never met any of my children. So for my daughter to tell me that she always felt like my mom was there, and she had said that to me before, and I was like, okay, yeah, that's, whatever. But it didn't really click until the psychic lady had said that, and how she does, in fact, hang around Rebecca, my daughter. She also said... Now, my daughter, for those of you that don't know, is an aspiring chef. She goes by the name of Chef Bella B. Our first season, we were trying to help her promote her business, right? And so I was telling June, I said, yeah, well, she's feeling a little down because, being an entrepreneur is hard, right? Yeah. It takes a lot of work. And June told me, tell her, don't stop. She's meant to be seen. She goes, I see this. She is destined to be seen. She goes, I'm not talking trillions, but I am talking a massive amount of wealth. So I have come to the conclusion that I am set for retirement because Rebecca's going to have a massive amount of wealth. So I just thought that was my paranormal experience. So I guess, James, the long story short is I have a ghost in the house as well. Not a ghost, because she comes back and forth. June says she goes back and forth through the spiritual plane. She is doing fine on the other side. She only comes here when she feels that we need her.
And I can see that with your mom.
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
That is my paranormal experience.
See, and well, thanks for sharing, Kel, because it's a little different, huh?
It's when she was telling, and it's so funny because when she said you have a spirit over your left shoulder, I did look. I looked over my left shoulder like, you don't say, right? But it didn't scare me, right? And it's so funny because as I went back and listened to the podcast, I didn't react at all. I wasn't like, oh my God, I wasn't freaking out. I was just like, that sounds like my mom. right? And then knowing how she passed away, her telling me that my mom is telling her it burned, and I'm sure pancreatic cancer burns, and how they treated my mom for years for ulcers, right? And so how she was saying, June said she knew she shouldn't have ate that food. She knew that food was not good for her. So I thought that was incredibly interesting that this lady who I had never met saw my mom standing over my left shoulder and then gave me a bunch of other information.
Okay, now, I'm going to play the devil's advocate because people are going to do this, okay? They're going to say, okay, well, you know, she threw out you know, grandma, and you automatically went to mom. You know, and then they're going to say, well, you know, she said niece and you went to daughter. But they're not seeing the other things, you know. Did she know how into education your mom was? How important that was to her? You know? And see, so these are the things I think about. It's like, it's just something, it's just not coincidence. You know, I could see maybe getting one thing right, maybe two things on guesses, but how did you know about your education? Okay, well, education is important to everyone, Jane. You know, but that was part of your mom's, I don't know, personality or makeup, you know. That was part of her, you know. I always remember that, you know. And I could see her coming back and helping Rebecca and watching over you guys, you know. And I think the fact that you weren't afraid, you know, that's good because I think you pick up that energy, you know. There's nothing to be afraid of, you know.
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly interesting. And I've gone to psychics before, right?
We talked about going to Dave.
I've gone to psychics before. I've had tarot card readings and, you know, I've had people tell me different things. Now, it's funny because Dave, who's actually coming on the podcast very soon, is another type of psychic. But like June, he doesn't use anything like tarot cards or anything like that. She was simply talking about her book. She never tried to like get information out of me. You know what I'm saying?
Anything out of you, yeah.
And we never talked about me at all because when these authors come on the other podcast, it is simply about them and their book. It's not about me, so we don't talk about me, right? So for all the things that she knew, I thought was fascinating. And she said, and for those of you who are, you know, wanting to find out more, her book is called How to Talk with Spirits. Her name is June Adhern, Adhern. And I thought, she said she's been a psychic for 40 years. She now teaches people how to connect. Because she said everybody can do it, right? Anybody can connect with a passed on loved one. Anybody can connect with spirits, right? And she said that in her book, that's what she teaches people to do.
Well, maybe we should try and get her on this podcast.
You know what, James? You are a smart dude because we should try to get her on because she had a lot of good stuff to say that I would deem as crazy shit.
All right, people, there's your teaser. We're going to work on it.
Yeah, we're going to.
Or Kelly's going to work on it. My bad.
We're gonna work on it because we're a team. We're going to work on it and see if we can't get her to come on the podcast. So I just wanted to share my paranormal experience, not as in-depth. And I will say this much. I did go to James's house a couple of weeks ago. I did not see the portal. But I
showed her where it was, though.
He showed me where it was. I didn't see it. However, I am sitting in the kitchen, and I'm typing away on the computer, because we're going to do some podcast stuff. And I sitting there, and I feel something like shake. And I was like, what is that, right? And I just kind of went on about my business. And then it happened again, and I finally said, God, James, what is that? And he's like, what is what? I'm like, you don't feel that? He's like, what? Is the floor shaking? And I was like, yes. He's like, see? It happens all the time, but it only happens in this chair. Only in that spot. And so, yes, I did feel the shaking. I don't know what it was, but I did feel it. So I guess that was my other little paranormal experience. Because it didn't happen, and only in that one spot.
Okay, now let me try and describe it to the listeners. Okay, so it's my dining room table, and I usually sit at the far end. Okay, and I was sitting just to the left of Kelly, 4 feet away or something, And when she's feeling it shake, I didn't feel anything, And then when she said, I felt, I'm like, see, I told you. Because the one time we were doing our video chat, remember I start looking off and you're like, what's going on? I'm like, I feel something shaking. Remember?
Yeah, I do.
See, so it's great. That's crazy. And I'm glad that you felt it because now it validates me.
Yes, I felt it. And I didn't even remember that you told me that spot has the shakiness to it. And that's the only spot around that entire table that you could feel shaking. And it wasn't like all the time. It was just random times.
Yeah.
Right? Just randomly shake. So I got to tell you, it was crazy. So yeah, I didn't stay in the haunted house, James's haunted house. I only visited for the day, and then when it got dark, we had to go.
We were out.
Because it's like I tell my friend, I know 2 people now that live in haunted houses, you and Molly. My house is not haunted because my mom comes and goes. And it's just her as far as I know. I don't know if there's any other spirits walking around, but my mom is more than welcomed.
Now I have a question. Would you want to know if there were other spirits?
I would not want to know. I am completely happy the way things are. Sometimes ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
And so I do not want to know. I don't want to know anything about that. I'm good. I'm happy living in my little bubble. I'm good.
So, we talked about how young kids and old people talk about seeing things and no one believes them. Has your grandson ever acted like he saw something?
Yes, he has. And I would never tell him not to play with his imaginary friend or whatever. I remember being a kid and having imaginary friends. My imaginary friends were these 2 twins, right? They were twins, not like The Shining, because this is before The Shining. Right, not The Shining. But they were 2 twins, and when I was little, I would say maybe like 4, I would wander off. And I would wander a ways from the house because I would be wandering. I was never by myself. I had the dog and these 2 twins, right? That would be with me. And then next thing I know, I would turn around and the dog would be gone. The dog went back home. And I remember one day when I was walking, the twins were gone. And next thing I know, my parents pull up in a car and they'd be like, how'd you get all the way over here? And I don't remember how I got over there because I didn't know where I was. I was little. I was like 4. But I used to wander off a lot. But when I wandered off, I was never by myself. I always felt like I was with these 2 twins. And I just thought everybody could see them. But in retrospect, maybe not. I don't know. I can't really say.
Okay. And you had talked about this a little while ago, and where we grew up, our neighborhood, and okay, so you picture Kelly's house and then her destination. Between those 2 places, there was like busy streets. There was the river you had to cross. You either went over the road, bridge, walkway next to that, or remember you could cross on the railroad tracks?
Yeah.
So there was the only...
And the railroad tracks would be over the river.
Yeah, over
right?
the river.
So there's no railings. It's just, like you see
for a
movies.
Train.
Yeah, so if the train came and you were on that part of the track, you were out of luck. Because there's nowhere to go but into the river.
Yeah.
And so, when I remember being kids and playing on those tracks and crossing it, because that way would put you the back end to the park.
Yeah.
Right? You could get the
shortcut.
But as a little kid, I would wander all the way to where the busy street was and the traffic was. And how I got there, I really don't know.
And that's funny because I had read a story. It was actually a book of stories about angels and people's encounter with angels. And some of the stories, a woman was working in a rough neighborhood, and she'd walk every night, home to this, tough neighborhood. There'd be all these, criminals around, and she used to think, well, God, it's a miracle I don't get killed or robbed or whatever, And then it turns out, like, she ends up talking to one of the guys on the street, she's like, well, why did no one ever attack me or rob me or try to rob me? He says, because you have those two dudes with you, those two big dudes. He was, they're like 6'7", buff. He said, they were with you all the time. He said, who would want to start trouble with you? But she never saw him.
Wow.
And then there was another story about how this young couple or a woman with her kids had gotten stuck in a snowstorm, and a tow truck comes and hooks them up, takes them to the house, and she goes up to the door to get the husband to pay the tow truck, and they turn around, the truck's gone, and there's no tracks in the snow. How is a tow truck going to tow this woman? It's snowing, all this. There's going to be tracks. So it makes you wonder, maybe they were your guardian angels.
Maybe. It's very possible. I really don't know. I remember being little, though, and the dog, I think our dog's name was Butch. He would come with me as well, but then Butch always went back home, and I never, he would just, I guess, get bored and be like, I'm out of here and go. But yeah, so those are my two semi, not really up to James's paranormal experiences, but paranormal nonetheless.
And that's the thing, people have all these experiences and they don't think they're paranormal, but that is. If a kid can go that far and be safe, that's not normal.
Yeah.
And I remember that we used to cross that bridge, and even when we were older, it was kind of sketchy.
Yes, I remember all the time. Yes. And so I just wanted to share that with you, and that's really all. I don't have any other paranormal experiences, but I am excited because we have more guests coming up in the future.
That's true, but don't forget, Kelly, you've seen stuff in the sky too.
Yes.
Where you're at, so that counts too. Don't dismiss that stuff.
I remember one time when I was still married, my ex-husband's parents were here visiting, and it was in July. And I was outside in the backyard, sitting at the table, just, chilling or whatever. And I look up and I see these lights in the sky, right? And they're kind of hovering and they're kind of flying low and slow, and it's not a plane. And I was like, what is that? And so I go get everybody. Come look at these lights in the sky. And we must have looked at these lights for a good 30 minutes, right? So my husband saw them, his dad saw them, his mom saw them, everybody in the house saw these lights. And none of us could explain what it was, because number one, they didn't really move as they did hover, right? So they weren't moving, they were just kind of hovering. They would zigzag back and forth. One would turn into three, then it'd go back into one. And
that sounds like a commercial airliner.
But you know what? Until now, James, I never really thought of it as a paranormal experience as much as I saw a UFO. Because a UFO is what? An unidentified flying object.
Just unidentified, yeah.
And we could not explain what this was. I mean, we sat there, me and my ex-husband's dad sat there and watched them the whole time.
And you're in a hot spot.
Yeah, I really am. Colorado is a hot spot for all types of weird shit. Like one day we got to do a whole show on the craziness that they say goes on at the Denver airport. DIA has got some shit with it. Let me tell you something.
Yeah, there was some crazy stuff going on with that.
Some crazy stuff, and still crazy stuff going on, right? They say all this stuff about Denver DIA, and one of the stories is that it doesn't even handle as much traffic as the old airport Stapleton did, and Stapleton was closer into town, right? It was like the Salt Lake City airport, where you get off the airport and boom, you're downtown.
Yeah,
like 15 minutes later,
15,
right?
20 minutes, yeah.
That's the way Stapleton used to be, but why they put it out in the middle of nowhere? And if you've never flown into the Denver airport, it's out in the middle of friggin' nowhere, and it is huge. And they say it's got underground cities in there. It's got cryptid messages all over, you know, with the paintings and the stuff in the floor. The horse that killed its master. There's a blue Mustang rearing up on its hind legs as you come to the Denver airport. Oh, I'm sorry, a Bronco, but it's blue and it's got red eyes. And I know that when the guy was sculpting this horse, it actually fell on him and killed him. So I kind of find it odd that they would still put the horse up. I guess that was in memorandum, but I don't know. My sculpture kills me. I don't think I want y'all putting it up. I'm just saying. That's me. Whatever.
Maybe
so,
blood sacrifice.
See? Now we start with the conspiracy theories.
See how easy you can start it?
Maybe.
I think we should start one.
Well, I think somebody's already said that. But at any rate, James, I just wanted to share that with you guys. I wanted to share it with the listeners. And, you know, you can get us. If you want to share your story, come on. You should do it. Yeah. You can get us on. You can email us. thatsomecrazyshitpodcast@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at K&J's Podcast. We are on Instagram at @that's_some_crazy_shit. And we are also on Facebook. We're also on Twitter, That's Some Crazy Shit. So share your... Oh yeah, and we also have a YouTube channel. So share your story with us. You know, comment, get at us, interact with us. We love it. James, until next time.
Keep your minds open.